Buenos días, eh, buenos días, señoras y señores. Bienvenidos a las.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Celso Furtado room. We would like to ask that you take your seats so we can begin this conference, this keynote conference, as part of the keynote lectures on ECLAC's 75th anniversary. At the end of the keynote speech, you'll be able to ask questions scanning the QR code. So welcome to the Celso Furtado room here at ECLAC. We would like to open this keynote lecture within the framework of ECLAC's 75th anniversary. We will be offering the floor to Santiago Levy, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, to offer a few words of welcome. We would like to offer the floor to Jose Manuel Salazar Chirinax. We would also like to greet those who are following us online and on social media. We'd like to welcome authorities, members and representatives of the diplomatic corps, officers of the officials of the UN system, and colleagues, representatives of the corporate world, academia, civil society. We would like to remind you that February 25th, 1948, by Resolution 106 of the Economic Social Council, ECLAC was created in Santiago, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is its 75th anniversary, so ECLAC is holding a cycle of keynote lectures throughout the year until February 24th. We'd like to remind you that you can ask questions once the conference, the keynote speech has ended through the QR code that is on the screen. Without further ado, I'd like to offer the floor to Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Jose Manuel Salazar. Good morning. Good morning, all. I'd like to offer a warm and cordial welcome to all who are joining us in person or virtually for this keynote lecture, one in the series of lectures commemorating ECLAC's 75th anniversary, and this is the 7th in the series. I'd like to especially greet the authorities of the government of Chile, representatives of the diplomatic corps, officials of the UN system, and colleagues. Today we are continuing with the cycle of conferences with which we celebrate the history and achievements of our house, but also and above all, conferences that challenge and inspire us to reflect and deepen our ideas and analyses in support of countries in order to build, as our motto says, a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. Among the challenges facing the region are low economic and productivity growth, coverage gaps, and weaknesses in our social protection systems. These are two challenges that are interrelated and feature prominently. We were talking a minute ago with Santiago Levy about the importance and the opportunity of bringing these two themes together. This will be part of today's conference.
Today we have the honor to hear our speaker and friend Santiago Levy
with a lecture that in various ways links these two challenges, which are social protection and productivity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Santiago Levy is one of the Latin American economists who has combined a distinguished career of theoretical and practical contributions. And he has been able to learn from practice to formalize original ideas. Santiago has researched and published extensively and held crucial policymaking and implementation positions in his home country of Mexico as well as regionally. Santiago has contributed to a better understanding of the problems of poverty, competitiveness, exchange rate, and trade policies from academia and
Esta trayectoria en la que el estudio, la disciplina, el rigor académico se construyen y están al servicio del trabajo práctico para atender las necesidades del desarrollo latinoamericano, y es casi ocioso decirlo, pero calza perfectamente con la trayectoria y la visión de esta casa, de la CEPAL. Y por cierto, ha sido la característica de muchos de la distinguida lista de economistas prominentes que han trabajado en esta institución en sus 75 años. Pensar para hacer y hacer reflexionando y analizando es lo que ha hecho Santiago. Y es lo que también hace la CEPAL, y por eso, además de por la enorme relevancia y centralidad de los temas que cubrirá, esta conferencia resulta particularmente apropiada en este ciclo del 75 aniversario para celebrar nuestra historia y para fortalecer nuestra capacidad de enfrentar el futuro. Como académico, Santiago ha recibido numerosos reconocimientos por su trabajo, entre otros el Premio Nacional de Investigación en Economía del Banco de México, el Premio Latinoamericano de Economía, el Premio de Investigación del Banco Mundial, en este caso último por su trabajo de evaluación del Tratado de Libre Comercio entre México y Estados Unidos. Sus trabajos más recientes se han centrado en el reto del crecimiento con inclusión social en América Latina, una preocupación y un foco que nos ocupa también aquí ampliamente en la CEPAL. Como responsable de políticas públicas, entre el 92 y 93, Santiago Levy fue director del programa de desregulación económica en el Ministerio de Promoción Comercial e Industrial. Entre el 98 y 94,
between 93 and 94, president of the Federal Competition Commission of Mexico. Between 94 and 2000, he served as vice minister of the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico, where he was the leading architect of Progresa Oportunidades program. This was a pioneering program of cash transfers sought to reduce poverty and in turn meet improvement objectives in health, nutrition, and education. He was also actively involved in pension reforms and policies to decentralize resources to subnational levels of government. He managed budget adjustments during the economic crisis of 94-95 and the fall in oil prices in 98. Between 2000 and 2005, he served as general director of the Mexican Institute of Social Security, where he promoted legal changes for pension reform and the expansion of coverage to rural workers. He oversaw managing health services for 45 million people and led the introduction of the electronic medical records and the management of care systems. Regarding his international career prior to his current position at the Brookings Institution, Santiago was president of the Latin America and Caribbean Economic Association, senior advisor to the United Nations Development Program, and between 2008 and 2018, 10 years, he served as vice president of sectors and knowledge of the IDB. At the IDB, he published essential contributions on crucial issues such as informality, tax reforms, and productivity. In his book, Poorly Rewarded Efforts, The Elusive Quest for Prosperity in Mexico, he discusses the causes of low growth and stagnant productivity in Mexico. Likewise, he examines the role of public policies, however, they have objectives aimed at social inclusion, subsidizing the low productivity sector, and slowing down the country's growth with adverse effects on growth with inclusion. In his book, he proposes fundamental changes in policy making that can simultaneously drive productivity growth and social inclusion. These two challenges are essential for Mexico, as well as the entire Latin American and the Caribbean region. So without further ado, I am pleased to offer the floor to Santiago Levy to give us his keynote speech commemorating ECLAC's 75th anniversary. And Santiago, you have been acknowledged.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días. Bueno, en primer lugar, mil gracias, José Manuel.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Manuel, for such a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much for you being here and for the invitation and the privilege for being here. And congratulations, a huge hug of congratulations to ECLAC for its 75th anniversary. It is a privilege to be here. We all read much when young, and if we are reflecting on these 75 years of the institution, we can see what we have all learned from ECLAC and what we owe to ECLAC. So it is a tremendous privilege to be here as part of this celebration and to have the opportunity to share some ideas on what we're all concerned with. There's a presentation, so if somebody can help me to have it on the screen. You can all see it, yes? Maybe it would be wonderful if we can see it here as well.
Ok. Ya habló José Manuel.
Jose Manuel, I am talking about the motivation, but I have an issue. And the problem is I cannot read so far. So I will try to place myself in a different area. Or maybe if you have a handheld microphone, I can stand over there. My apologies to all of you. As soon as I return, I will go to the eye doctor. You are very kind. I will use the computer. Are you able to read this? No, not even using my eyeglasses.
Si quiere hablo con el micrófono.
Sí, el micrófono.
O sea, si me prestan el micrófono.
So maybe I can use the handheld microphone.
Sí. ¿Funciona este? Sí. Perdón que te doy la espalda, José Manuel. Ahora sí, si la ponen otra vez. ¿Se puede? Ya está. No, ahí.
No, pero ahí ya mejor no conviértenos ahí. Sí, déjala por si acaso. Aquí se lo dejo. Pongamos ahí.
Pero ahí no se puede. No. Ahí está. Ya. Listo. Ok. Empiezo por lo que.
So I will start with what we all know. We are one of the most unequal regions in the world, and depending on the data, it is even more unequal than the sub-Saharan Africa. And that is true, even though in the past 3 decades, the decade has made tremendous effort in improving expenditure in social expenditure, and it went from 7 to 14%. That's number one. Number two, when we are one of the regions of the world that is growing slower, and the reason why we're growing so little is because productivity in the region is stagnant. Somewhere between 1990 and right prior to COVID, the growth of the productivity was, as a matter of fact, a negative growth. I have been working for 15 years trying to see which is the relationship between these two data. Why are we the most unequal region in the world, even though we have made tremendous efforts in social protection policies, and even though we are accumulating capital, work capital,
we are the region that is growing slower and everything is so stagnant. I do not have the full explanation, and what I will be doing today is to try to argument that the architecture of social protection in the region is part of the explanation for the data we have. And right after really taking about 40 minutes, I will be able to say that this has a very important background in ECLAC's thought to create a conceptual bridge between these two elements, making use of what ECLAC has been doing. That is the main motivation. I will beg you for 10 minutes patience of your patience, just 10 minutes of this patience, to provide you with an analytic, a conceptual framework so that we can all think about this. As on a personal basis, much that what we have here is a lack of language and a lack of analytical framework to be able to simultaneously be speaking about social protection and productivity. And the idea is to build upon language. It's not a theoretical model, but rather an analytical model. So forget the macros. There is no inflation, no macro, no exchange information. I will try to present three areas of public policy, the core of public policy of all our countries. The first one is all of our countries are regulating the way in which companies and workers are relating to each other. It is regulated in many different ways. One is all the regulations in the non-contributive aspects when the companies um, if they have to pay a minimum salary, if they can fire people and how. And in this areas, contributions, pensions, disability, death, or housing, all depending on our countries, and the protection to unemployment and minimum salary. I will be calling it the Bismarckian regime because the origin is in Bismarck in from Germany. We brought it around 1919, 1920, and then we went to the Andean countries in the 40s, and then in the 50s, almost all the region had a certain legislation, something that was born in the head of a German person that went through Europe. We brought it to Latin America, and that now is embedded in the Constitution, the labor laws, and social security of all our countries. And that is the Bismarckian regime. And then to the non-contributive programs, to the whole program of parallel programs that we have been creating in the past decades, and thus provide health, pensions, and some sort of support to the whole population that is excluded of this Bismarckian regime for any reason that you might want. Uh, for example, if there are Peruvians here, it's the CIS regime, the contributive system in Colombia, the popular system in Mexico, the daycare centers, the contributive programs, the elderly. There are a number of programs, but the key is it does not go through companies and workers, and it is dedicated to those that are ascribed to this. It's the first area of public policy.
The second is the tax framework. Taxes on income tax, and on companies, which is very important. These special regimes for smaller companies, SMEs. I will talk about that.
Fuera del mercado laboral.
And transfers outside the market. And the third is all the conditions regulated by the market, be they free trade, not free trade, whether there's tariffs, quotas, etc. It's all very important for ECLAC. The third element is whether there are policies for productive development, subsidies for green companies, and everything that is sometimes called policies for productive transformation. So I'm going to talk about these. I'm flying at 50,000 feet altitude, and I will bring all three together in something that I call E, the environment. That is that strange looking E that we see there. And that is what comes out of these three areas of public policies called the rules of the game. In ECLAC language, it is the social pact or the fiscal pact reflection. So this environment is extremely complex and varies between countries. Very complex. No one really understands it because we have too many rules, regulations, laws. But normally we all group in our mental exercises, we group these and say social protection policies are grouped in the first two areas in social security laws, labor laws, and that's how you fight poverty, unemployment. And then you have the market policies to promote productivity. That is grouped in the third area. That's where we have subsidies to innovation, all the policies of development banks, etc. Let's assume that in this abstract economy, we have X individuals. I'm talking about any country, it could be Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay. There's X individuals, and each one has a certain degree of human capital. Some have primary, some secondary, some university level studies. There's capital goods, and there are technologies available, and the companies or corporations use specific technology that have these T's of technology. So I need to define productivity, and I'm going to quickly express a total productivity of factors, PTF, which is a weighted average of the productivity of the companies that are in the market, weighted by their size, how big they are. So productivity is an average of everything that happens in the country, and it depends on how many companies we have, their size, and how productive they are. I'm also going to talk about social protection. So allow me to introduce some new language here. I'm going to say that formal workers are the ones covered by contributive social security, and the informal workers are not covered. That doesn't mean that they have nothing. They may have some sort of access to some non-contributive program, daycare or health, but they're simply not in the same regime. And I can classify the country's population on the right-hand side here between formal Bismarckian regime and informal outside of the Bismarckian regime, and I classify them in terms of risk, and the poor have their income under the poverty line, the non-poor people are above the poverty line, and the question is, how do you distribute the population between quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4? Because ideally, we would like for everyone to be in quadrant 1. But there is a good part of the population in quadrants 2 and 4, and a lot in 3 and 4. Important information. Informality and poverty are not the same. So informal people are on the right-hand side, and the others are in 2 and 4, and the poor are below. We tend to confuse informality and poverty, but it's not correct. Sometimes we have more informal workers than poor people. Many informal workers have similar income to the non-poor group. So we're going to go from 50,000 feet down to 30,000 feet now. Depending on who has access to this program, if I find myself in quadrant 1, I have the Bismarckian protection. If I'm in quadrant 3, I have Bismarckian and maybe some other condition transfer program for the poor. If I'm in quadrant 2, maybe I have some non-contributive health program. So it, depending on where they find themselves, they will have access to different levels of social protection and different income levels. So what are our economies doing? What happens in our countries? We have workers with different levels of scholarity, of schooling, there's technologies available, and there's an environment and public policies in labor aspects, tax aspects, and they determine the red arrow, which means that they simultaneously determine how many companies we have in the market, their size, productivity of companies that have chosen the productivity of the technologies available, and the country's productivity. At the same time, who has access to what social protection company? So I can calculate the Gini index, poverty indexes, inequality. If I have all this and I understand this equation, I know the world. It's a certain way of decoding DNA fully. No one really understands how this works. No one fully understands how it functions. We've all been studying and trying to understand this for 30 years. The point I'm trying to make here is that what is happening on the right-hand side of the red arrow, the country's productivity and access to social protection of the individuals and their income, are all joint results or the result of the environment, of that complex environment that includes all this. So, what do we know about the productive structure of the region? We have some stylized actions carried out by the CAF, ECLAC, IDB, the World Bank, and many others who have contributed to this literature. But what do we know? So we know that economic activity in the region is highly dispersed. Around 50% of the working force is working in a self-employed fashion or in very small companies, say 5 workers or less. So the information I know best is Mexico, and 95% of the companies have under 5 people, and sometimes 95% have under 10. But this is not only in Mexico, Colombia, Peru. We see this in different countries. So there's a large number of small companies, and most of them are informal. That is a fact. Second, distribution is biased by size. So in the same sector, there are companies that have very different productivities. In the production of wood furniture, for example, in the same industry, there are companies that are very or extremely productive and some that are not. The same with men's shirts, microphone production. In the same sector, there are companies with varying levels of productivity. That is well documented. Informal companies are also less productive than formal companies. And the dynamic in these countries, the corporate dynamic is very dysfunctional, because sometimes there are companies, but there is this Schumperian destructive process that we see in the market. And the main question that we've all asked ourselves for 30 years is, what policies in this environment generate these results? What explains the fact that the productive structure in Latin America will have these characteristics that are very different from the OECD and from Southeast Asia? What is there behind this? So here is this question, 30 years old, and which has not been answered. So the Levy vision, which is probably partially wrong, begins from the explanation of these results, not the full explanation of the results. So I'm going to start linking these results, which are the foundation of why productivity is stagnated in our region. And maybe it's at the heart of why we are growing so slowly. So let's first take a look at social protection policies. For this, I would like to highlight the link in both directions that there is between companies and social protection. Almost all people who study this know that what companies do is very important for social protection. So first, there's many companies that have paid workers because they are part of the Bismarckian system, and there's some that have very few paid workers. Are there many or few family companies, and some, of course, either cheat or abide by the law. And how much are they cheating? How much are they actually abiding by the law? If they cheat, they're not paying the pensions of their workers, they're not paying minimum wage, and of course the workers suffer. What companies do is determined by social condition. Now, the other side of the coin is social protection policies that also determine what companies do. If the legislation says that you're hiring a salaried worker and you can't fire them, companies will say, oh, I'm going to think about this twice before hiring a paid worker. If I have a negative shock, then you can't fire them. So we need to simulate bankruptcy. And if I have to pay 50% of the salary or wage to Social Security, but the social services are very bad, workers won't have a pension because they don't have the necessary number of working hours, which is true for many workers in the region, they have an incentive to evade this. That's why we have a huge level of illegality in the company's behavior in the region. There's tax evasion. So the size and type of companies depends on the social protection system. So I'm going to delve into a Mickey Mouse model here, and hopefully you can question this and challenge it in your questions. Say I'm a company in Colombia. Here we have workers in Colombia, and the company and the workers, as I'm going to describe, this happens every day. They get together and they say, listen, I'd like to hire you. Should I hire you formally or informally? If I hire you formally, the company pays formal salary, and we need to pay all of the social security contributions, and we need to pay the minimum wage. If you're hired formally, what does the worker receive? Formal salary and health and pension and disability insurance, assuming that they're going to receive their pension. But 1 out of every 2 workers in Mexico that contribute to their pension will not receive it because they don't accumulate the 20 years that they need to receive the pension. The same happens in Peru, Honduras, Paraguay. Chile is an exception, but it's an exception to what happens in most of Latin America. And you have daycare, but sometimes you go to the daycare center and they say that the service is rationed, or it's low quality, or they say stand in line and they'll help you in 3 days. This happens every day with social security systems, with the Mexican system and Peru. It's a systemic issue. So what does the worker receive? They only receive a proportion of what the company has paid. And the difference between what the company and the worker paid and what the worker actually received, I'm not talking about what the law says. I'm talking about what happens in practice. De facto is a tax to hiring formally. What happens if in the same negotiation between the Colombian company and worker, this happens? Okay, listen, I'm going to hire you illegally. The company will run the risk that the Colombian authorities can detect us hiring illegally. We may be fined. Probability is beta, the fine is M, but we pay an informal salary, so the worker will receive the salary plus any benefit established through the non-contributive sector, when the state says all those that are out of the Bismarckian regime have the right to a non-contributive health system or service. It's desirable, and I'm describing the other side of the coin, the one we don't like to see, that says what is happening de facto, which is subsidizing the status of informality.
Gratis.
Because something that is provided for free, it's conditioned. But what happens if I work on my own? For most of the legislation of our countries, the uh, workers that are independent are not forced to be part of the social system. And it is also providing access to the non contributive programs, and we're subsidizing the activities. With this is expressing that the articulation or relationship between the contributive and non-contributive programs and the minimum salary and the regulations inadvertently are taxing formal work and subsidizing the other type of work. And I realized this when I was the director of the Social Security Institute, thinking that all of the workers were really wanting to participate in this, and that all countries really wanted to, and not workers. And I realized it was not so, because in practical terms, what was happening was that there was a tremendous evasion and a tremendous amount of workers that did not want those because they thought their contributions were not worth what they were being received, what they were receiving, and that parallel programs we were creating that I promoted when I was working in the finance ministry by providing health in the informal sector, they were really suffering in that area. So this is what is happening in this area of public policies. I will not go into detail here, but what this says is that this will be uh, taxing informality, and this is only when the companies are productive to support this burden and minimum salary. Informality will occur when companies do not have that level of productivity, and informality probably will continue the more generous the benefits of non-contributive programs are, and self-employment or family companies will continue the more generous these benefits are. So there is a very specific, tangible mechanism, and I will be talking about the empirical aspects later on. But what is happening is that, again, I want to repeat myself inadvertently, it is distorting what companies and workers are doing. So what do we do in many of our countries? We're saying, okay, because the micro companies and SMEs are all important in the creation of labor, we will be promoting them through special contribution regimes, and they're part of the social protection policy to have these special systems that are almost existing in all of the countries of the region. And we have an example for Peru. If Peru has a micro enterprise that sells less than $180,000 per year with less than 10 workers, the contribution to Social Security and the benefits are are expressed here. And if it is with less than 10 workers but with sales of 2 million, is what we have in the second column. And if it is a large company, it's what we have in the third column. What the Peruvian law is expressing is don't be large. Same thing as with Honduras. In Honduras, the enterprises pay the minimum salary according to the size of the company. As they grow, their minimum salary becomes higher. So what companies do is they divide themselves. Either they do not grow or they end their activities so as not to pay this. Ecuador has two tax regimes. I will not go into detail, but basically up to 9 workers and to a certain level of sales, their tax regime is very low. They once go to the 10th worker or they go above the threshold of sales, and the tax regime increases enormously. In a document that was created for the book that will be published soon, I have a graph that is very interesting, and I don't have it here. It's saying that if the companies go over the threshold, they lose. Therefore, I am summarizing what is happening with social protection from the perspective of productivity. Well, there is a completely different perspective. Of course, there are health benefits, social benefits, pensions, and others, but in terms of productivity, I go back to those squares of the workers. If I go from the right column to the left column, I am implicitly taxing that movement. But if I go from the right column to the left column, I am subsidizing that movement and what is happening from the perspective of companies or enterprises. As I grow in size, it is either probable to have the tax department finding me, and either I go to the general system and it crashes. And that is what is happening. So this policy, the LNT areas at 50,000 feet altitude, they are segmenting the work environment, a key element, the endogenous segmentation to really establishing a relationship when these policies are establishing a bias in this area of activity. And of course, there's tremendous variation in our countries. If I think of Chile, it is probably the country that where it is less relevant. But if I think of Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, Bolivia, Mexico, Honduras, and Central America, what I am saying is quite relevant. If I think of Uruguay, what I am saying is not too relevant. If I think of Brazil and Argentina, it is more or less relevant. So there's heterogeneity in the countries of the region because it depends on the parameters of functioning, and it also is dependent on other policies. And I will go back to that aspect. Given all of the other elements, the policies of innovation, of marketing, international markets, the social protection policies are creating barriers to be part of formal activity. When they are entering this, they are being taxed and they're subsidizing unemployment, and they will be changing the business dynamics. I just want to show you a graph that is very nice, and it is the last paper I published, so I'm very happy about this. If you're able to see it, you have the distribution of productivity of all companies in Mexico in blue for 1998 and in red for 2018. To the right, we find the most productive companies in Mexico, and to the left, we have the less productive ones. And right in the middle, we have those that are in between. And there are a number of little points there. Isn't this a beautiful graph? A way to condense so much information is amazing. And under the red line, there are 4 million companies. What happened in Mexico between 1998 and 2018? 2 million companies were dead. Of the 2.5 million companies, 2 million were out of business. Only 500,000 survived. And the market saw an entry of 3.5 million companies. It was a brutal rotation or turnover of companies that are dying or entering the market. And what happened with the distribution of productivity of the companies? To the right of the panel, I am magnifying these areas. The red line is above the blue line. That should have not happened. There are more unproductive companies in Mexico in 2018 compared to 1998. More. In the lower area, the red line is to the right. There are more productive companies in Mexico in 2018 compared to 1998. And both things are true at the same time. There is a polarization of productivities. A small segment of companies, approximately 100,000 enterprises or businesses, became highly productive. And a segment much larger than companies, very small but very huge number of them, became unproductive. This whole rotation of companies was inefficient because productivity in Mexico dropped. And certainly it dropped for a country that increased manufacturing exports of a 5% GDP to 35% of the GDP. And in a country that today is exporting $400 billion of manufacturing products, is more than the sum of all of Latin America. So the question is, How is it possible that a country that is exporting 400 billion in manufacturing goods of spare parts, aeronautics, electronics, you name it, how is it possible that in that country, with a tremendous success in promoting exports that was not even dreamt of at ECLAC or in any other fora, has this response? And the response here is the left side of the graph of what we do not talk about. And as these are all informal businesses, the question is, what is it that all of these informal companies as part of the market are surviving in the marketing, and when they're dead, another one enters the system? And I created an exercise of separating how this worked. It's a decomposition, but what happened in Mexico, there has been a tremendous rotation in the past 20 years. Many unproductive companies are leaving. The ones that survive are not growing. And this is impressive. Mexican businesses are not growing, and a number of low productivity businesses are entering.
Privatizamos alrededor.
We privatized around 1,000 companies. We opened to international trade. We have free trade economies. We have competition regulation. We fixed M at 50,000 feet of altitude, right? But the problem was in L&T. A very important discussion in the region. I don't know how many papers exist saying no, informality is because of low productivity. No, 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 low productivity is a result of informality. I think it is the wrong question. I think the relevant question would be, what exists in the area of public policies in our countries, in the environment created by this tremendous and complicated interaction of policies regulating the labor market, the taxing systems, and market policies, with companies with such different productivities in the market, and many companies that do not hire their waged employees. Why does this happen? And when responding this question, the response is not only what I have been saying in the past 20 minutes. That is just part of the response. Another part of the response is related to what ECLAC has emphasized for a number of years. Another part of the response is related to there has been no or insufficient market policies. Maybe the transformation policies have not been aggressive. Maybe the development activities have not gone through what they have had been supposed to do. I'm not saying that the social protection policies are the only explanation of the phenomena that I explained earlier. I am saying, though, that they're part of the explanation, and I am saying that depending on the country, it can be a less relevant aspect of the explanation, and for other countries, it's the most relevant response. For the country that I know best is Mexico. I believe it's the most relevant aspect. Why am I saying this or expressing this?
Well, some of us are old enough to remember the USSR. The USSR also had very bad resource allocation patterns, but it was the opposite problem of Latin America. There was a huge number of very large companies that did not innovate. There wasn't any self-employment. There were no small companies, no technological innovation, and that worked. Latin America also has a huge productivity issue, but it's very different. Our patterns, our resource allocation patterns, are totally different. What we all need to explain is why, after 30 years of macroeconomic stability, after free trade agreements, we continue to have a PA of 50% working in a self-employed fashion or working in companies of 3 to 4 people. Why don't we have long-term contracts? Why do we have formal and informal companies coexisting in our markets? And why did Schumpeter never come to Latin America? I believe that we cannot answer these questions without observing social protection policies, because the resource allocation patterns that we observe are the ones that would be generated with the policies that I described earlier. I didn't bring, in the interest of time, I didn't bring a summary of the literature that has been written around this in the last few years. I published this for the UNDP a couple of years ago. We have many references to the literature, but there must be many other papers and reports published for Argentina, Brazil, empirical evidence. We don't have them for other countries, very few for Uruguay and Paraguay, but we do have them for the larger countries, where we show that everything that I was saying has empirical background and support. Now I'd like to take a leap and connect what I was saying to two things that have been what ECLAC has worked on mostly these 75 glorious years. ECLAC has made many contributions in many dimensions, but there's two that truly matter to all of us. Here, there are many authors that have worked on this, my dear friends. First of all, ECLAC has profoundly contributed to social protection. The pioneering reports of ECLAC on fiscal pact and social pact are of the utmost importance, and ECLAC has insisted on this for a very long time, on social and productive transformation. Please be patient. Let me go back to 50,000 feet. I'd like to share ECLAC's work with the language of this presentation. What has ECLAC done? ECLAC has studied two things, it has said. I'm going to take social protection policies, L and T, and I'm going to study how these social protection policies impact the access to social security, poverty, and inequality. That is the first line we see there. That is a mapping. We're going to invite how these policies, L and T, labor, minimum wage, health, pensions, etc., how these policies impact informal, not informal, poor, unequal, etc. That is the first line. The second line of work has been, okay, I'm going to study market policies, foreign trade, South American transformation, integration, industrial policies, the development bank, etc., innovation, and how those impact the productive structure. To see how many companies we have, how productive they are. ECLAC has studied social policies and productive policies. What I'm bringing to the table here is the need that we see in the last line. It's the need to say, you know, there's another important link of social protection policies to the productive structure of the region. And in fact, that's what I commented on the last few years. It's very difficult to understand why N is so large. Why do we have so many companies in our countries? Why are most of them so small? And why are they so unproductive without appealing to social protection factors? So what I'm saying is, it's not that ECLAC hasn't done a splendid job in studying the first two mappings. What I'm saying is that I feel we need to work together to study this third link between social protection policies, and I believe that all economists and ECLAC and the US have separated the world into two main parts: the world of social policies and social protection, and the world of productive policies. And we have been working along separate paths. It has been a conceptual error on our behalf all these years, and the intention to separate them all cannot be achieved unless we are studying very small changes. But we need to think about these policies, and I'm saying something that is trivial. The social protection policies are a productive policy, good or bad, but it is a productive policy. How much are we spending of the GDP in subsidies to innovation and adoption of technology and development banks? 0.2, 0.3, 0.4? I've exaggerated, didn't I? How much are we spending of the GDP in social protection? 5, 6, 7? We don't spend much more in social protection policies than in productive policies, but we're not thinking in the fact that we're generating productive policies through this. Having said this, I think that ECLAC has shown the way, and here I become a follower. I say many of these arguments of ECLAC are fiscal pacts, and I put myself in the position of someone who has learned from this. And now I'm a preacher. So the call of ECLAC, this universalization of social protection, apart from the huge benefits that I'm not going to talk about right now, open the door to begin to overcome this negative link that we have in social protection and productivity in the region. There's a dilemma that we have in the region, which is that we have a fundamental incompatibility in the structure of social protection and productivity. I'm not talking about Progresa and the families and the senior citizen products and policies. I'm talking about this in general. It is an exchange that is very difficult for governments. Those of us who have worked in the government know very well. We say, oh, there's all these people that have been excluded from the Bismarckian regime. And they say, oh, yeah, well, you know, in about 50 years, we'll include them. Or another says, we need to do something. We need to create parallel pension programs for health because they don't have one. And that's what we did in the region the last 30 years. What we didn't realize is that that prevented them from being a part of the system while hitting productivity. We have conceptualized this growth as if it were two processes, a social process and an economic process. And my point, it's a little obvious and at the same time important, is that this way of understanding it has been wrong. We need to think about socially inclusive development as a holistic program process where there's an adequate articulation between market policies and social protection policies so that we can all walk hand in hand to a society that is equally productive and socially adequate. So, you know, maybe the Chinese and the Americans are going to fight, and they already have, and the lithium might save our life, or something's going to save our life, some miracle coming from abroad, as has always been the case, and maybe we'll grow. But we will not grow with more social inclusion because the structure prevents it. The policy will be no more contributive processes. In Mexico, we're spending 3.4 of the GDP for senior citizens. Now we're spending 1.3% of the GDP on senior citizens. But it's happening in the entire region. Ecuador 20 years ago was spending half point of the GDP. Now it's 2.5% of the GDP in non-contributive system. So it's still good from the social perspective, but it's not what we want to do from the productive perspective. So Latin America can grow with a little bit of show and a little bit of macro management and a little bit of luck. But I'm going to conclude by saying that if what we want is to grow with social inclusion, what we need is a radical transformation of the work sector. We need to eliminate informal work. And the promise of ECLAC on the universalization of social protection is precisely that. It is the possibility of overcoming this formal and informal dichotomy by articulating social protection. We're going to win because we will have a more effective social protection. That doesn't mean that we won't have any market changes. 20 years ago, I was an Orthodox. I thought that the industrial economy was a sin and we had to pick picking winners was bad, etc. But my point of view has changed. I do believe that there is a very important space and a need for productive development policies in the region. But I also believe that the first thing we need to do from the perspective of transformation in the region is to stop this anti-productive transformation policy that represents social protection policies today, and we would win twofold. We would have more productive societies and at the same time, socially inclusive. Thank you very much for listening.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, enorme.
Well, huge thanks to Santiago for his extraordinary and motivating and inspiring talk. Thank you. It is clearly many years of experience and thinking of these matters. You've been in the field and also putting deep thought into this. This conversation you're inviting us to have is very much part of the ECLAC spirit, social inclusion, productivity, etc. So there is a very innovative element, which I believe is clear, extremely clear in the presentation on this link between social protection and productivity. And this third line, as you mentioned, with this challenge to ECLAC. Thank you for the concepts and for validating, because it is a starting point, this aspiration of universality. But you shot a laser beam on this need to stop having anti-industrial policies that put stop to productivity. We need to have productive policies. I'm glad you changed your opinion in this regard, because we are huge enthusiasts of productive development policies, but they are not separate silos. Governments have it like that, but in the truth be told, there is an important link there. I would like to begin, as we have in several other conferences. We still don't have any questions with the QR code, so I can begin by asking a few initial questions. In terms of the model that you presented, the conclusions are very clear and undeniable, inescapable as well. So, well, let's ask a question at 30,000 feet and then we'll land later. You've been criticized by saying that the point of reference of your model has to do with competency and the microeconomy, and that public policies distort the markets and reduce their efficiency and productivity. And you have on one side you may have perfect competition, but we know it never is, and then we start to look at the structural characteristics of economies. Therefore, at 30,000 feet, the question is this maximization of earnings by consumers, is this positive, and this approximation to competition, is this crucial for your model or not? It's sort of a question, but maybe not the right one. But in order not to be so abstract, two more questions. In empirical terms, and you did mention part of this, have you quantified the magnitude of incentives and disincentives referred to in your paper and estimated the consequences that they have on the behavior of these companies? That is to say, how much research is there in this regard? And have your hypotheses been tested through what we might call quasi-experiments, such as expanding social security to regions, maybe not a full country? A public economy of this transformation that you are mentioning is a huge obstacle, but that could also, you could also refer to that. But have you held any quasi experiments in regions to change the social security financing, or is there something perhaps that could be similar to what the Chinese do? We experiment in a region, well, except that Chinese can do it in a region of 30 million and it's still merely a speck in the country. So have you carried out any comparative studies between countries with different financing structures? That is, and just to make it a little more positive, is there still a broad agenda for research to show or prove the validity of your model?
Bueno,
They are amazing questions. They're all very good questions, and thank you. What I presented here and the book that I published about 20 years ago, the analytical framework is quite perfect. Area is very clean, and we obtain the results. And the virtue of it is that it is intuitive, but it is not necessary. And I will not bore you with technical information, but in the past years, I published two papers, one on the National Economic Review and the Econometrics, with a couple colleagues of the IDB, and it is not my merit, it's theirs. And we turned it into a model where labor markets have tremendous friction, where companies have a possibility to negotiate and they have a monopoly on the workers, and the workers have a monopoly on the companies. They negotiate among them. There is a full and complex process. And the essence of these results is maintained because we're talking about quite basic elements. Public policy is taxing certain relationships between companies and workers and subsidizes others. And that is an independent element, independent of the market. It is more of a fundamental aspect, more than theoretical aspect. The empirical evidence that we have it from Latin America, where the labor market is not competitive, but we have empirical response, and I'm responding there. Maybe I went too fast in terms of this empiric reference. There are papers that are talking about this. The ones that I know best are the ones from Mexico, where there is a comparison of the creation of the non-contributive health program in Mexico that was called Seguro Popular. First, it was done in certain town halls and then in others, and the economists were then comparing what was happening in those town halls or municipalities where it did occur or not. And these are academic papers that were published in that area, and they expressed that these issues were going in the direction expected. They have similar effects for Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, that have studied maybe the pension programs and other ones, health systems, and what has not been done. The approach to date has been going very slowly, or maybe just one thing at a time. And I will be talking about the impact of this pension program, of the problem of the daycare, of the minimum wage, of the impact of this health program, and others. And what I presented here, and this is why we were flying at 50,000 feet, is we have all the programs at the same time, all the regulations. We, Jose Manuel, do not have any mathematical models that are able to reflect that complexity. And here we have an amazing analytical challenge saying, how do I express all this? And how do I express the interaction of all this with the taxing policy? What I described of Peru is endemic for the region, and I believe it is underestimated. And for those of you that create these policies at ECLAC, hopefully you will work on these areas because they're quite problematic for many reasons. So there is an analytical agenda for research that is helping governments, and I believe ECLAC with the other multilateral groups, the IDB, the World Bank, the UNDP, all have a very important role because governments always have a perspective of the health sector, of the daycare centers, and nobody comes and says, okay, great, but you have to see the big picture. So there is an analytical challenge in that area and something very fast related to this type of policy. I think we have tremendous opportunities in this area. I think policies or economic policy is far less complex than what we think. And I think that what ECLAC is calling for universality is quite promising because properly done provides a win-win solution, a solution of winning from the perspective of better social protection and to win in terms of more productivity. The challenge, Jose Manuel, don't see as tremendous. Of course, there are interested parties, maybe some unions, some bureaucrats or others. There is always an interest in this area, but the larger challenge is the concept, is the challenge of linking everything together, of changing our ideas and the importance of social protection for productivity. And if there are ambitious proposals with the echo of the IDB of ECLAC, we open a path for the region that, I don't know if you have the expression in Chile, but it is really hitting hard. It is going here, going there, and public policies is a tremendous problem. What we have not had is a compass that will be able to link all this. I think it's more of an idea than a problem of interest. Wonderful, thank you. And I think that was pretty much what I really wanted to hear in terms of the analytical challenge, the space and opportunity of continuing thinking about this approach. I think the approach is quite interesting, or too interesting, so as not to keep thinking about this. It is so important in terms of the development models and their transformation. And out of those questions, especially its first one, 30,000 feet in altitude, and when launching that important program where you were the main architect, Progresa, and with all of the experience that exists in other countries, which are the innovations, or how do you see those programs now? Which is the next step? Which are the innovations are needed to be implemented and thus comply with the goals of breaking this intergenerational poverty issue? Wonderful question. And it is a question that makes me very sad. What happened? What I see or read, if you wish, here is Progresa is active. They are all successful programs. Progresa has an echo within the region, in the families in action, the development bonus in Ecuador, and other things in Peru. And there's a tremendous condition transference done, and there are expenditures of, depending on the country, 0.3, 0.4 of the GDP. And they, considering different countries, and the coverage is of 15-20% of the population, or at the most 25%. And all this is very positive because we know that improves nutrition of the children, improved participation in schools, the position of the women in the family. There were many benefits, and we have empirical evidence, and that is quite large. I believe that there is a tremendous confusion in this area, a tremendous confusion in language and public policies, where considering this quote unquote social protection wording, we're confusing the income transfer program with social insurance. And please mentally go back to that 2x2 matrix that I had in my presentation, if you remember, where I had the column of the formal and the informal column, depending on the access to this market regime, and the poor and the not poor, depending on their income level. Do you remember that 4x4? Yes. What was Progresa? What was Bolsa Familia? What was the other program? These groups were programs for the lower group, for those that were in a poverty condition. It was not a program to offer health insurance, disability insurance, protection for unemployment. It was not for this. It was for income transfer so people could invest in their human capital, and the next generation of uh, poor youngsters with better education, nutrition could obtain a formal job. Progresa was for that lower area of the chart. And the confusion here was to confuse the lower area with a column on the right, where the non-contributive health programs of pensions, of daycare centers, we're all being confused in that area of social protection, of social insurance and others. And we added too much money to the column on the right rather than the lower area. In that lower area, we had a 0.3, 0.4 of the GDP, but on the right column, we had 3, 4% of the GDP, depending on the country we're talking about. Therefore, we did not consider the overcoming poverty goals. And that is why I'm so sad, because I have a graph that it shows when Progresa started, schooling of poor children and families increased, and the health indicators have increased. But the rates of participation of poor workers in the labor work, or their informality rate, did not change in 25 years, and their wages did not increase. We invested in human capital of the poor people, but parallel to this, and that is the confusion here, we dedicated 3, 4 points of the GDP to ensure that they have an informal job. And it is very sad. And we all were applauding the increase of social expenditures, even the IMF. And there's tremendous confusion in that area. And that is why I want to mention what ECLAC is saying. Universality is not about the condition transference program, but it is around social insurances to overcome Bismarck and to unify the health, pensions, disability, death, and others through the social security. And in that world, Jose Manuel, the condition transfer programs will play a lower role than what they have nowadays. The governments are systemically mistaken because they're trying to compose this idea of not having a left foot working with a bigger shoe, and that is not it. The idea is social assurance. Is this it is not in human capital of the poor families where we have been able to progress. But hopefully in the future, we do not go through the area of more and more income transfers, because that really breaks this social cohesion, the creation of social capital. What we want is to have universality to share the risk from the social perspective, and with the provision of assurance. And I'm sorry I went too long in this response.
Que ahí hay otro mensaje.
I think there are other messages that I had not clearly heard earlier, and that is a tremendous challenge in those areas that we need to be talking earlier. And probably you will be talking to the specialists in social policies that, as in ECLAC, as in other areas of the conference.
So we have several questions from our participants. Maybe I'll ask two, and then we'll cover some others. So Ramon Pineda asks, what implications does this architecture have on the accumulation of human capital on the workers of the region? That is one. Marco Dini is asking about the European experience and the isolation. So can you include these chains or chain systems? Excellent questions. I didn't include something here that Ramon put on the table. We went to dinner yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that I don't think that anything I described is a problem of human capital. The reason is that if you look at what has happened to the returns in Latin America, they've dropped. The difference between what someone makes in prep school or university school regarding or compared to what they make otherwise has decreased. If we had a problem of human capital, it should have been the opposite. The returns on education should have increased. So why are they dropping? I'm going to offer you an example that is pretty simple. In Mexico, tortillas can be produced in two different ways. But they can be produced in little workshops. All they need to do is to read and write. They put this in some metal cones, and then some tortillas come out. So we have about 90,000 companies in Mexico that make tortillas. The technology is quite simple, but in Mexico, we also make tortillas in large companies, Maseca or Minsa, which have a very sophisticated technology where you need engineers and chemists, and the company needs lawyers, accountants, etc. So if all the companies in Mexico that produce tortillas are these small companies, what about the demand of lawyers and others? If all the companies that produce tortillas were like these large companies, they would need many lawyers. If the distribution by size of the companies in Mexico, which has had an inclination towards informal companies, returns to education would be higher. And here's where I connect with Ramon. And the returns in education are low, and the possibility of accumulating human capital while the workers are in the labor force are less. Remember the number of the amount of turnover there was in companies? How much do you think these companies invest in training of their employees? What for? They have an expected life of 2 years. There's a lot of turnover. So if you compare the workers that are in informality what they're going to find is that there is greater human capital in economies where there is a certain informality. So this does have a high cost. Going to Marcos's question, isolation in two dimensions, regional, but also isolation in terms of some technical details that have to do with the tax regime and should also be investigated. There are some special regimes where companies are told, okay, if you have less than X number of employees, you will fall under this regime. And if not, if you have more, you will be assigned to the more expensive fiscal regime or tax regime. If you're in the first one, you can't issue invoices. Large companies are not going to buy from the small companies in ECLAC language. They are being hindered. Jose Sheckman has a wonderful document for Brazil where he shows that this generates value chains for informal and formal companies that isolate the formal and informal economies. And in Mexico, we have around 50,000 large companies that export $400 million. And the chain moving back is extremely weak. What we've seen is that this didn't fix the problem that we've had, and it maintained the isolation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very important insights. So KG is asking, what about the role of the companies to increase their productivity with greater associativity? That is one question. Ramon Pineda has another question, very prolific, but we're going to give someone else a chance. Lucia Retes, what are the main areas of opportunity of these special regimes, and how can we transform them so they can fulfill their objective? Excellent question from KG. I believe there is a lot of space to strengthen these chains looking back and the links between small, medium, and micro companies. To do this, we need to put them in the same tax and regulatory programs. We need to understand that some of these smaller companies are going to cease to exist and that that's good. Understanding that if we have universal social security, the welfare of workers is independent of the company's future. So there is a higher link between companies and these chains. So the idea is to link the social protection with what happens in companies so that companies do what they know how to do, being productive, having higher salaries. So I think that there's significant space, room for doing this. If I had a magic wand, I would disappear them. To Lucia's question. So the question is, what do we want them for? Why are they there? What is the objective of public policies? Having smaller companies or having productive companies, irrespective of their size? What is the objective of public policies of having these smaller companies? Public policies aim to have companies of the size they need to be, but they need to be productive. They need to generate good jobs and they need to pay good salaries. So these regimes prevent all that. The case that I mentioned yesterday was dramatic. For a Peruvian company, going from micro to medium is catastrophic because their costs increase enormously. So that is why we need to rethink these. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're going to take a close look at this. How do you explain the cause of universalization of these associated to productivity? And I'm going to leave this there. If we have a microphone, if we have someone that is not familiarized with this and we want to ask a question as we did before, you can ask after this question. Thank you for your question. What is the chain that connects universal Social Security with greater productivity? If funding of health is done based on general taxes, if it's all done as a result of taxation and the access to social benefits has nothing to do with companies, nothing to do with the jobs that workers have, then we achieve something important. Companies don't need to carry certain costs and they have access to social and health services. If we do this and we take these benefits of childcare, we would allow companies to be much more flexible, grow, and carry out midterm contracts, maintaining welfare of protected workers. This requires a redesign of labor conditions, of the layoffs, and most of our legislations say that companies can only fire their workers for justified causes, and that means that either they came in drunk or they stole from the company. But demand shock and technological changes are not a cause for layoffs. That makes relationships very rigid. It's important to have good employment insurance with access to benefits for all workers and adjusting to Chinese competition, technological change, etc., etc. So companies, if we take away special regimes, they can be larger. If they're larger, then they're more stable. If they're more stable, they have a greater capacity to train their workers, economies of scale, all this together with the mechanisms that will improve things for all. It's not a magic wand. What we're going to do is we're going to take away the anti-productive transformation one, and we do it because there are some serious market failures, and you know it better than we do. There's some genuine lack of coordination and market failures that we see that markets aren't going to generate other structures, and we need to maintain development, subsidies to innovation, everything else that you know well. One or two more questions. Alberto Arenas, Titelman, Roberto, one, two more. Ana Gesmes, three questions then. First of all, thank you very much, Santiago, for an excellent and highly motivating presentation that once again leads us to a very interesting analysis, and it basically aimed to describe formalization as a way of social protection. It moves in both directions. It actually prevents us from advancing to certain formalization and contributive or non-contributive systems. And what it has, that the main challenge that ECLAC has seen has been advancing towards universality and eliminating this contributive and non-contributive system to avoid this negative feedback. And the main challenge is a fiscal pact. We need to break this relationship between contributive and non-contributive. It's a it requires a very strong fiscal situation. And in the case of health, for example, when at the 50,000 feet in health, there is no analytical correlation between contributing and needing the system. So contribution doesn't have any correlation of why I need to pay if I'm going to look at other risks. And the main challenge is that to eliminate this contributive and non-contributive dichotomy, we need a fiscal pact and a fiscal drive that will help manage the expenditure. It's all part of the package, but we have a huge challenge that we haven't been able to address.
Alberto, please. Well, good afternoon, Santiago. I can see that you're so able to be challenging everybody. So congratulations, because you have done this for so many years. With this idea of overcoming Bismarck is 135 years, where we will be able to see, Santiago, what is happening. And let me comment on a couple of things that I saw from your presentation, and then a question. When we present two ways or two paths, social policy and productive policies, and ECLAC has been working in both of them. And there you mentioned that they are not well connected and that there is a tremendous challenge there. Among other things, from ECLAC to have expressed or placed in the midst of the development strategy, sustainable development, it has three dimensions, which is our motto. It's a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. And that sustainable development is balanced at least in three dimensions: the social, the productive economic one, and sustainability at environmental level. So yes, and we have it here at ECLAC. I don't know if it is probably linked, and at least from that perspective, not to see inclusive development as part, a fundamental part in the strategic area of that sustainable development. And if, of course, this needs to be combined with a productive element or others, that becomes part of our philosophy of sustainable development. Therefore, certainly, that is a topic that I wanted to share. But I have a question that, in Jose Manuel's words in political economy, and something Daniel just mentioned. In social protection, if we talk about pensions, for example, pensions are a social element, but basically it's a fiscal perspective. To tackle this becomes a fiscal element. It is not, of course, outside of the design arena, but it is fiscal, and having very well linked in the discussions of the region, and not only in Chile, the in this proposal, we say, well, there is a major fiscal element. If we uh, don't forget Bismarck, how do we fund this sustainable or social element? And I will keep your sense of universality. I do understand how this all works. And we go along the same way in with different goals, but one of the important discussions here is how to reach that universality in one dimension. And here comes my question: in financial sustainability, how do you reach that sustainability at financial level if finally we do not have contributive social funding, but rather finance it from a different way? But that fiscal perspective already has a complicated element from different countries without ending the contributive fiscal areas. So I'd like to hear your opinion by talking from your times at IMS. and you were really working in that area of sustainability and IMS. Anna, please. And now that will be probably the last thing. Yes, good morning. And I want to also congratulate this conversation and the challenges of this. And I also value that this program is really advancing, where there is a perspective and demographic perspective. Jose Gomez de Leon was the very first social mass program that offered scholarships to girls, and Mexico was very much the first country that obtained parity in education. And the question that we're working in the gender department is the universality of Social Security and social protection that goes through an interface that is not created yet, which is the universal care systems, and that is related to a dimension of social protection, but also is related to a productive dimension, which is the economy of care, a sector that will be growing. And it is one of the sectors that we are presenting from ECLAC. So more than just a discussion that of course I do share, which are these models based on taxes, as some of the European regimes have universality of social assurance and the non-contributive or mixed systems, is this educational parity that did not transfer to a quadrant. There is a 50% of women that are not even in one of those quadrants because they're not even in the formal or informal employment system, even though there's investment in human talent and others. So, which would be your thought in terms of care, the care systems, and this renewal of public policies from the gender dimension? Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias a los tres excelentes preguntas.
Thank you very much, the three of you, for those wonderful questions. Daniel is right. ECLAC's work has been fundamental because fiscal pacts have all been linked to social pacts. And one without the other, well, a fiscal pact without a social pact does not work. It's a backbone. This goes together. It's part of the social contract. And what we're talking about here is redesigning the social contract that today becomes a dysfunctional social contract. And it does imply to increase the taxing load. And this can be done in many different ways. And there is tremendous heterogeneity from the countries of the region, in the countries of the region. And you probably know it much better than what I do. There is tremendous heterogeneity. It is very hard to provide certain signals at 50,000 feet elevation. The countries of the OECD, you know it very well, charge 8% of the GDP to the income tax return, and the other countries charge at the maximum 2.5 or 3. No, 2, somewhere around there. Social solidarity is expressed in countries of the OECD through a redistributive instrument on income taxes that from redistribution is far more efficient than the contributions to Social Security. When contributions to Social Security are harming the salaries. So, one point would be income tax. Second, evasion. And there's very important work done in ECLAC. I do not remember well, but in this paper we mentioned it, Daniel. I think you sent it to me. There are estimates of ECLAC of the level of evasion in the different countries, and depending on the country, the tax they're considering, the income tax, and there are some important areas with evasion, and this goes together with informality and special conditions, and we're trapped in a vicious circle. When we are subsidizing informality, we're also subsidizing the erosion of the taxing system. We can really widen this basis of taxes. I don't know how much of this tax basis will correct the different elements. But what I am saying here is that the combination of evasion and others is eroding this tax basis. And what I am copying from ECLAC, if I want to be really intellectually honest, I would really widen this tax basis without necessarily really increasing the taxing rates. The taxes to property, uh, some green taxes. There are areas for this, and I would like to now go to Alberto. This does not have a simple policy, but depending on how this is being uh, mentioned, what is important here, and it is a communications challenge that is enormous, and I don't know how to solve it, is to explain to the society that in the current balance, almost all of us are losing. We're all losing because we have non productive economies or because we're not able to obtain a good redistribution. Last night at dinner, we were commenting on the Gini index after the transference tax in the OECD. And many of you know probably at OECD, the Gini index of the market is approximately 0.4748 after the taxes and transference and social activities then becomes 0.30. Latin America, the Gini index 0.5152, a little higher than OECD, but not more. But the Gini index after Social Security and transfers tax 0.49. So it's lower. Therefore, combined taxing with the social the social framework we have not right now is not contributive to equality, and there is an area to move around. What would I do is to separate past and present. We all are inheriting, and in Chile you're paying for it, and Mexico is saying the individual accounts, the labor pass liabilities that are here lying. These are all problems of the country that will need to provide us some sort of service. And of course, pensions are always subject to income tax. Many of those pensions are regressive. They're in the deciles 8, 9, 10 of distribution. And from there on, I am not proposing to pay the retirement pensions in the general taxing system, but rather my proposal is to pay those retirement pensions in the income tax for the person itself, so it becomes an incentive to increase these areas and it reduces the load. And I have the numbers from Mexico, they're preliminary numbers that can be corrected and so on. But what I am talking about, it will cost less than 3 points of the GDP for a country with a tax load is 0.53 or 17 points of the GDP. It's 10 points lower than many of the countries. And I am not minimizing this problem. I think it's a communications problem. This balance that we have right now doesn't work properly. Anna, I do agree in what you're saying, but the condition transference and what we have, we were able to improve the imbalance in gender in schooling. And nowadays, for women, they go more to school than others, and everybody is very happy 25 years later. My girls and wife love me very much when I say this. But what we're not able is the gender parity and or equality in the labor market, in the labor area, and who are suffering informality as women. And they have higher levels of informality, they have less possibilities of obtaining pensions, retirement pensions, or maternity support. And this becomes a tremendous inequality and also inefficiency because the feminine labor participation is very low in Latin America, especially compared to OECD. And I think that childcare is part of the solution. I think there's something else that we never really understand properly, which is cultural standards that we have to overcome, the perception that we have uh, to overcome. But there's much to be done in having women participating in the labor market. The proposals on the table is a child care service. Let us consider that primary schooling, that it's public and financed in all of the countries. In most of the countries, it starts at 5 or 6 years of age. Why not start at 3? Or why not at 2? Or why not earlier? And earnings in terms of equality and others would be so important. Well, thank you very much. And being 1 p.m., we want to thank you all. Thank you very much. You are leaving us with tremendous challenges, but important lights as well. Antonio Gutierrez challenged us to become a beacon. And so thank you very much. And I think there is an announcement. Why don't we mention when we have the following presentation of the cycle? Thank you, Executive Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Santiago Levy. We want to invite you to review the website of ECLAC, the conference cycle that is announced. And I would like to invite those of you here in the room to meet outside, and want to thank you for the participation of those that were online with us. Thank you very much. Directors, please come up here to a photograph.